we come together to contemplate God. This in itself is a great honor and privilege, that one's own intelligence is drawn to the act of the contemplation of the reality of God. But how does one begin to contemplate the infinite intelligence, the infinite love, the infinite imagination, the infinite power of God? Can your mind even attempt to grasp a reality from which our own minds are derived, but contain only such a slight, it is an immeasurable amount of the intelligence, the presence, the love, the power that is God? The human intelligence is completely out of its depth. And because of the impossibility of a finite intelligence to grasp the intelligence which has given birth to an infinity of infinities, requires an infinite capacity to make itself infinitesimal and to bring its intelligence down to absolute simplicity. And God has done that for us. Even though very few can understand the meaning of this advent of the presence of God into this world, let alone the fact that this entire world, including the space in which we sit right now, is located nowhere else but in the very heart of God. Do you realize where you are? Do you realize the source from which your own ability to be aware derives? To what you owe the power of your own ability to understand, to whatever extent you do understand? And the reverence, the awe, the surrender that is required to be able to be sufficiently dilated, sufficiently open, sufficiently free of narcissistic self-enclosure, to be able to admit the light of God into one's consciousness, so that one's own heart and mind can vibrate in resonance with that supreme power, and to be granted access to that supreme intelligence is the greatest gift imaginable. Do we recognize what we have been given? The honor, the privilege that has been bestowed because God has come to this world and revealed the truth in a way that our minds could understand, could, if we could but only recognize the implications of what we have been taught. Imagine the very definition of God has been formulated for us in 2 words. Aham, aham. Have you actually contemplated the meaning of these 2 words? This is the Immaculate Conception. Do you understand the significance for yourself? This is the definition of God, but this is also the definition of who you are. And who you are is the meeting of the I that is seeking God, seeking to know itself, meeting the I that reveals itself. But has this meeting taken place in your consciousness? Has the seeking I stopped looking in the wrong direction and returned to meet that I that awaits the surrender of the nomadic egoic I, who is too blind to recognize its own source, and offered itself to that I so that the I of the God self would open to reveal the true nature of the one seeking I with that which is the revealing I, and the 2 could at last become one. This union is Sat Yoga. Not a union of sperm and egg, not a union of 2 egos or self and other, but the union of I and I. But can we grasp the meaning of I when it is freed from the belief that I am a body, and I am a thinking entity, and I am a sensual, mortal, physical, external blob of protoplasm that requires stimulation to its nerves in order to know it even exists, with some kind of waking capacity to think and feel? Or do you recognize that the I that you are is unborn, uncreated, and the source of the very phenomenal plane that you consider to be your world is only a dream that has given birth to an illusion in which the false sense of an I has arisen for the purpose of awakening you to the need to search for the I that has created this very world as your dream. And so to find God, one must become lucidly awake in the dream and not take for granted some false assumption that the dream is real, and hold on to the premise of being some mortal entity seeking some ethereal and impossible connection with a God you can't even believe in because you can't imagine the vastness and the immediacy and the immaculacy of that presence that is already within you and is you, but that you cannot know except through total surrender of the I that thinks to the I that is and knows, and in whom the I of the ego flits around without recognizing the sacredness of the ground upon which its thinking takes place. Unless we begin with a sense of complete and utter reverence and awe, the I that is seeking cannot recognize that it has been found, it has been drawn magnetically to the source of our being to contemplate that reality. As a gift to end its lostness and suffering and misery, but that the I of the ego will not sit still, will not bow, will not prostrate itself and humble itself sufficiently to be open to the revelation that is being offered. It cannot get let go of its addiction to its own thoughts, even though those thoughts are the cause of its misery, its suffering, its agony, its repetitive compulsion to bring itself down into the most degraded form of its own imagination, and unable to rise to that ability to see beyond the event horizon of its own mortal scope, of its own limited capacity to conceptualize. And it cannot imagine letting go of all of its concepts in order to know its own being, through surrendering to that which cannot be thought, cannot be encountered as another, cannot be grasped, can only be known through absolute surrender. The level of humility that is required to recognize God is absolute. It requires the complete and utter deconstruction and elimination of all mental activity, all interference patterns, so that the vast immensity of God can enter into your consciousness and open you to the truth of your being. That the smallness of the I's own self-concept can never accommodate, except through its own death, its own self-sacrifice. So that through its transfiguration upon the death of its own thought form, the power of the aham is realized as oneself, the only self. And can we grasp the meaning of that onlyness? Because we're so used to seeing a world from the perspective of a being in that world. can we even imagine that the entire world itself is within the being of God? So that God cannot be grasped by the person that you think you are, but only by the elimination of the perspective of a person. And not only the perspective of a person, but then at a quantum leap of vastness of intelligence, the ego itself, which is not the ego of Freud or of Jung, not the ego that represents the infrastructure and functional dynamics of the thinking ego and its subconscious fantasies and all of the infantile sediment that remains in those regressive and primitive layers of infantile consciousness that erupt and cause us to be so immature and unable to have the reverence and humility needed to grok the presence of God in which we move and have our being. No. It requires the absolute incineration of that ego in order to understand the meaning of ego as Sri Ramana is presenting it, as the archetype of all archetypes, which is the cause of the very arising of the illusion of a world in which the person exists, as a figure in a dream who cannot possibly comprehend who is dreaming it into its illusory existence. The enormous shift of the locus of consciousness from the petty Freudian ego with which we have come to identify to that of the ego as its own true archetypal nature that gives birth to worlds, and worlds within worlds, and dreams within those dream worlds. Worlds without end, amen. Can we grasp the source and the author of all of these worlds and recognize that that author is no other than yourself? But yourself that you have never known, a self you can't imagine, a self of such greatness and power and intelligence that you can only know through sheer and absolute surrender, to the extent that nothing remains of the one who surrenders, because what you must surrender is the very form of your identifications, so that nothing remains but the purity of presence itself in its utter, most immaculate formlessness. It is this immaculate conception that Sri Ramana, in his mercy and grace, then simplifies down for us further with the formula of Om Sat Chit Ananda Swarup. But that itself is already just a minor glimmer of the splendor of what bliss means, because it can't be captured in a signifier. Or sat, being, you think being can be captured in a word? We have no idea what it means to be. Nor can we imagine, because we pretend that we know what it means not to be, because you cannot not be. And you cannot know your being if you're not in bliss, and if you're not totally lit up with the radiance and splendor of the Chit, the vast intelligence that shines with such a power that if you were to look at it straight on, your mind would be blinded from thinking forever. You can't imagine the power of the presence of God, and if you were to encounter it, you would literally die, as Venkataraman died at the age of 16 because he saw God and could not live. But through the mercy of God, that body came back to life, but no longer the body of a 16-year-old kid with anxiety, but a body that was used by God directly to deliver knowledge to us of the truth of that Supreme Lord of this and every universe, and to deliver that truth with such clarity and simplicity and power that the body needed not to remain. The body itself was put down the moment that it had been morphed into a corpus of teachings, a body of knowledge that remains now as an even more shining and immortal morti of that fullness of the plenum of God's presence, that just through reading a sentence of that shining vast intelligence, if we read it with the reverence it is owed, will bring us to an illumination that the ego cannot stand or tolerate without itself dying into its own source. And do we recognize that what we are dying into can only be our true self? But we can only die into it when we are true to the self that we are and recognize that our being has no reality if there is anything left in us other than love. Other than love that has such an intense purity that no ego can stand or survive its power. This is what we have been given. May we recognize with true reverence and surrender of our heart and mind and that which in us is our being to that one Supreme Being who comes to us not as an other, but as our very own heart coming alive to the power of infinite presence. May we know ourselves with such dedication to eternal life that we are willing to end the life of the ego in order to live as that.